Thank you very much. My name is Mohamed Hassan. I come from Sudan. I am a theoretical physicist or applied mathematician. I got my DPhil degree from the University of Oxford in thermonuclear fusion, theoretical plasma physics. But then after a few years, I changed my interest, and I worked for several years on environmental pollution using mathematical modeling to understand the movement of sand and dust and so on. Currently, I am the president of the World Academy of Sciences, and I'm also the president of the Sudanese National Academy of Sciences. So what I would like to do today is to talk about climate change adaptation in Africa, and that is really a nice follow-up to the presentation made by Joyce in the last session. This is the outline of my talk. I'll talk about climate change impact on Africa, and mainly I talk about the adaptation policies and strategies, and then adaptation actions, focusing on institutions, and then I'll have a few key messages. So, Africa, as you can see, is a huge continent, 54 countries, 34 of them are least developed countries. And this is what Joyce mentioned earlier. And this is 34 out of the 48 least developed countries are in Africa. The population, as you can see, there is a huge increase in population. It's now almost 1.4 billion people, constituting about 70% of the world population. But it's very important to observe that 60% of them are below 25 years, and 75% are below 35 years. So it is really increasingly becoming a young continent, probably the youngest continent in the world at the moment. Africa is very rich in natural resources. African countries have resources such as minerals. They also have oil and biodiversity in large quantities. The largest producer of gold, platinum, and diamond, 95% in the world. And 70% of the world's cobalt in one African country, that is the Democratic Republic of Congo. In addition, the continent has 14 classes of ecological zones, ranging from dry desert to humid rainforest, with varieties of rare indigenous food and medicinal plants, and wealth of associated traditional knowledge. And Africa, this is very important to notice, Africa has over 60% of uncultivated arable land in the world. So this is something that's increasingly becoming important because of the climate change impact. And if we lose this arable land to the desert or whatever, it's going to be a very serious problem for the whole world. Yet Africa has serious real-life problems. Poverty, 70% of the African people live on less than $2 a day. Malnutrition, infectious diseases, energy, 60% do not have electricity, water, 40% have no access to safe drinking water. And climate change is actually aggravating all these problems, unfortunately, the drought, the floods, the extreme heat, and the dust storm. And the climate change impact on Africa is huge. Africa is the most vulnerable to climate change impact because of its fragile ecosystem, weak infrastructure, and adaptation capacity. Yet, Africa accounts for only 4% of the greenhouse gases, and it suffers most from the impact. Climate change increases drought, floods, extreme heat, dust storms, and epidemics. And this picture you see here is from Copernicus, just a couple of months ago. And it shows all this huge dust cloud over Europe. This is transported from the Sahara all the way to Europe, and the United Kingdom. You see that as well. So that shows that, I mean, the whole world is really very well connected, even in environmental problems and so on. So this is causing hazard and causing health problems in Europe and also in the UK. Now, climate change impact, again, is really huge for Africa. In the year 2020, Africa faced huge floods, especially in East Africa, affecting more than 60 million people. The River Nile reached the highest point in 50 years in 2020, and the West locust outbreak in 25 years. That happened again the same year, 2020. And I don't have the data for 2022, but it is not worse than this. It's almost the same. So the impact is really huge. Now let me talk about adaptation policies and strategies. I will look at those in terms of global, regional, and national policies. So let me start with the global adaptation policies and strategies. To my understanding, the first time that the UN or the world looked at adaptation seriously was at COP16, the Cancun 2010, established adaptation framework and process for the least developed countries and other developing countries to formulate and implement national adaptation plans to address their adaptation needs. And the following year, at COP17, the COP17 invited the UN organizations and global funding bodies to support the national adaptation plans process in the least developed countries and others. And shortly after that, the National Adaptation Plan Global Support Program initiated or launched by the UN Environmental Program and the UNDP with funding from GEF. And that program fortunately supported a number of countries or assisting them in integrating the National Adaptation Plan into national development and financial plans. The support was provided to 45 countries in the developing world, including 11 African countries. Unfortunately, the program did not continue for a long time, I think mainly because of the lack of financial support. COP21, this very important, of course, Conference of the Party meeting in Paris, the Paris Agreement 2015. There an agreement was reached, and that is a very important agreement, that each country should prepare, maintain, and share nationally determined contribution, NDC, which is really identifying the action to reduce national emissions and adapt to climate change impacts. And also there was an agreement to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020 for developing countries' need. Unfortunately, that is far from being achieved. But in COP26 in Glasgow, there was an agreement, not about the $100 billion, but there was an agreement to double the annual funding to adaptation to at least $40 billion by 2025, aiming to reach the $100 billion soon after. We don't know whether this is, again, going to be achieved or is it just going to be a wish. There was concretely a pledge of $350 million to Adaptation Fund and $600 million to Least Developed Country Fund to bolster adaptation efforts. And that, I think, is on course. Well, COP27, so all eyes on Sharm el-Sheikh and Africa in particular. There is a big hope that for Africa, this will be a great opportunity to increase support to African adaptation needs through global climate finance. So let us hope. Some of you might be there. We look forward to at least getting some of this work done. Regional climate change adaptation policies. This is probably, I think, in my view, the most important action that has been taken by the African continent through the African Union to formulate solid policy and strategies for adaptation for the whole continent. Starting with the African Ministerial Conference on Environment that was established in 1985 by African ministers of the environment to coordinate action on environmental protection in Africa. That was followed by a very important committee of African heads of state on climate change, which was established in the year 2009 by the General Assembly of the African Union. So it's a head of state type of committee, and that is to facilitate a common position to ensure that Africa speaks with one voice in global climate change negotiations. This committee also established an African group of negotiators on climate change. This is the group that is supposed to negotiate the African position in the conference of the party. And you can see this picture here. You can see this group negotiating with the Americans. And finally, I think they agreed after a lot of work with the US to deliver increased finance for developing countries for adaptation in exchange of backing the COP26 deal. So if that wasn't done, perhaps the deal wouldn't have been done. We also have the African Climate Policy Center, and this is launched by the Economic Commission for Africa, and it improves its action is to improve the capacity of African countries to participate effectively in the multilateral climate negotiations. So it's really a capacity building or policy initiative. National climate change adaptation policies, again, this is really at the national level, just focusing on the national adaptation plans. So every African country should have a national adaptation plan. At the moment, to my knowledge, there are only 12 African countries that have submitted their national adaptation plans. But the nationally determined contributions, Africa is doing much better. In fact, even all African countries have developed national determined contribution plans that also include adaptation components. This is a point I want to make very strongly, that at COP26, the African countries committed what they said, $6 billion to climate adaptation as part of their national determined contributions, and requested an additional yearly contribution of $27 billion from other countries, because the calculation of the African Union and others is that Africa needs $33 billion to adapt to climate change a year. So what is good is that Africa itself is now prepared to pay. Although they suffer a lot from the impact without causing it, but still they are ready to pay. And I think this is a very important thing. I like it very much, because putting money there and say that, oh, we have not done this problem, you are the cause of it, but we are contributing to it. That I think should encourage the advanced countries, the other countries, to at least provide the rest of the funding that is needed for this. Now, climate change adaptation action, I just want very briefly to highlight the role of institutions. And before doing that, I think it's becoming now increasingly clear and important that whatever action you make for adaptation, it should not be just a single action. It should also be an integrated action with mitigation actions and with the SDGs. So we should really look for joint action for adaptation, mitigation, and SDGs. And this is very clearly seen in issues that are cross-cutting, like food systems, like health, clean water and sanitation, sustainable green energy, innovation and infrastructure, and drought and desertification. And to give you a concrete example, I'm just briefly mentioning here two very ambitious projects in Africa, very ambitious. One of them is the Africa Great Green Wall. This is an initiative of the African Union It's ecosystem-based adaptation action. It aims at building this 8,000 kilometer long strip stretching from Senegal to Djibouti and 15 kilometers wide. Sorry. Yeah, that's the one. And it involves the reforestation, trees plantation, resilient agriculture, ecosystems, biodiversity restoration. And the aim is to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land, sequester 250 million tons of carbon, mitigation of course, and create 10 million green jobs by 2030. The estimated cost is $33 billion, of which $19 billion have already been pledged through this Great Green Wall Accelerator initiative. It has started already several years ago, but is moving very slow. The other ambitious project is Desert to Power. This is an African Development Bank-led initiative, and its aim is to generate 10 gigawatts through photovoltaic solar systems using public, private grid, and off-grid projects by 2030. This will make the Sahel the world's largest solar production zone and connect 250 million people to green electricity. The climate change adaptation centers, I just want to highlight perhaps the most important one of them is the one that is established by the Global Center on Adaptation. Most of you know this center, which is based in the Netherlands. But in the year 2020, they established a regional office in Africa, which is luckily hosted by the African Development Bank, a very solid institution. And the programs of this office include improving the food security of 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa by 2030, developing nature-based solutions for resilient infrastructure, mobilizing adaptation finance, and building youth leadership. The Global Center on Adaptation recently published, some of you might have seen it, the State and Trends in Adaptation report for Africa. It's a very, very important publication. It also highlights a number of adaptation solutions and also policy recommendations. But for me, probably the most important and most promising program for adaptation in Africa is this one, which is called Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAAP. This is a joint initiative of the African Development Bank and the Global Center on Adaptation, and it has been endorsed by African leaders in April 2021. It's Africa-owned and Africa-led. This is what makes it really important. It aims to mobilize $25 billion over 5 years to accelerate and scale climate adaptation action across the continent. Now, the important point is the African Development Bank has recently committed $12.5 billion, half of the amount for this project. Is already committed by the African Development Bank. And that should include, the program should include empowering millions of farmers with digital climate services and climate adaptation technologies to enhance resilience and increase productivity, and to train 1 million young people across Africa for job related to adaptation and climate resilience by 2025. So they're very specific because they have numbers. Now, other centers in Africa, I just want to highlight the importance of having adaptation centers and programs within universities, because we would like to link education with adaptation, or adaptation with education. 2 examples I have here, University of Cape Town and University of Nairobi. Both of them have master's degree in adaptation. But there may be others. Maybe there are some, Sheikh might remember some in West Africa. But this is something that I think it needs to be strengthened somehow, because having centers and programs for education, for postgraduate education and also undergraduate education, I think in my view is extremely important. So finally, I just have a number of key messages based on what I have just mentioned. First, as I said, the African Union and member countries have successfully formulated climate change adaptation strategies and policies, but their implementation has been slow due to lack of sufficient funding, especially from partners in the North. African countries should each produce and implement a national adaptation plan to be integrated into its national development plan and nationally determined contribution. And African governments, number 3, should continue to increase their financial support to national adaptation programs and design innovative strategies to encourage adaptation finance and investment from private sector and global financial institutions. 4, adaptation actions should be aligned with both mitigation actions and the SDGs, as I said earlier, to deliver co-benefit. For example, these 2 examples I gave, Green Great Wall and the Desert to Power. 5, integration of climate adaptation and resilience into school and university curricula to prepare students for future green jobs and develop their capacities to lead adaptation solutions. 6, establishment of national and regional climate adaptation science centers linked to universities. 7, introduction of virtual and in-person training courses and climate change, resilience, and adaptation for young African women and men. And finally, number 8, which is very, very important, is the global partnership that which should provide the financial support needed to implement adaptation actions launched by the African Adaptation Acceleration Programs. So I will stop here, and thank you very much.